Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Responding to Intimidation and Human Trafficking Cases. My name is Charlie Whitman. I'm an Associate Attorney Advisor at AEquitas, the Prosecutor's Resource on Violence Against Women, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This webinar is designed to raise awareness for prosecutors and other criminal justice professionals about the dynamics and indicators of human trafficking as well as intimidation, and will challenge participants to reevaluate their approach to detecting and prosecuting these crimes. The webinar will explore the complex issues faced by prosecutors in identifying, investigating, and prosecuting human trafficking and intimidation while balancing offender accountability with the impact of criminal prosecutions on victims. Before we begin the substantive portion of our program, I will provide a brief overview of our iLink webinar service. For best use of iLink, I strongly recommend using our conference line, which is 530-881-1212, passcode 202-731-738, and that you call in from a landline. That number and passcode are in the top left-hand portion of your screen as well. If you're using a mobile phone, please do not use the speaker option, but listen with an earpiece if necessary. All call-in participants have been muted for the duration of the webinar. You can also listen to this webinar using Internet audio. To connect to the audio, please click the Connect button on the start screen of today's iLink session. If you listen using this audio option, please do not also call into the webinar. Only do so if you experience difficulty with your Internet audio. If you have technical issues, you can use the iLink hand raise indicator, which is located on the toolbar in the top left-hand portion of your screen, above the presenter's photo and to the right of the conference call number. Or you can contact iLink directly at 1-800-799-4510. Again, that number is 1-800-799-4510. Throughout the webinar, questions will be posed to all participants. You can respond to questions by using the iLink feedback indicator located on the left-hand side of your screen. Questions will be posed as multiple choice or true-false, and you will be able to select from the options in the feedback box. You can also post comments or questions via private chat, which I will share anonymously with the presenter so that they can be addressed during the webinar.
Thanks, Charlie. At this time, this is Jennifer Long. I wanted to pay special attention to the individuals whose work on witness intimidation and human trafficking has significantly informed this presentation. In addition to Audrey and my experiences and work with so many people in the field, it's almost unfortunate to have to pick a few. But much of the content of this webinar was informed by recent work on witness intimidation by the following individuals in this slide and on human trafficking, and so we wanted to acknowledge them here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Today's webinar is hosted by AEquitas, the Prosecutor's Resource on Violence Against Women, through funding from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on the Violence Against Women. Written materials, including a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and the presenters' biographies, will be emailed to you after the presentation. In addition, today's webinar is being recorded for later viewing. And also, you should have received a content link in the email reminder that you received, referencing a fact pattern that our presenters are going to discuss today. So if you haven't had a chance to download that PDF, I would just strongly encourage you to go ahead to that email again and access the content link and review that fact pattern. AEquitas' mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. AEquitas provides prosecutors with the support, training, mentorship, and resources necessary to objectively evaluate and constantly re-examine and refine their approach to justice. AEquitas staff conducts legal research, provide 24/7 case consultation, host specialized or state-specific training events and webinars, provide individual experts to jurisdictions and organizations, and publish articles, monographs, and other resources on topics relevant to the prosecution of violence against women. We're also joined today by Audrey Roofeh from the Polaris Project. Polaris Project is a leading organization in the global fight against human trafficking and modern-day slavery. It successfully pushes for stronger federal and state laws, operates the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, which we'll hear more about today, conducts trainings, and provides vital services to victims of trafficking, and works to create long-term solutions to the problem of human trafficking. And as we've heard from Jen, and I just mentioned Audrey, today's presenters are Audrey Roofeh from the Polaris Project and Jennifer Long, our Director of AEquitas. Prior to joining AEquitas, Jennifer was former director of the National Center for Prosecution of Violence Against Women at the American Prosecutors Research Institute, which is the research and technical division of the National District Attorneys Association. Prior to joining the American Prosecutors Research Institute, Jennifer served as an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she prosecuted cases involving domestic violence, sexual violence, child physical and sexual abuse. Jennifer has volunteered as an advocate at the Women's Resource Center in Hamilton, Bermuda, where she provided legal services to victims of domestic violence and served as a child advocate for the Support Center for Child Advocacy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ms. Roofeh joined Polaris Project as a National Training and Technical Assistance Fellow and became the program specialist responsible for the Southeast region of the United States at the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. She is now the coordinator of training and technical assistance for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. She leads a team that provides strategic trainings and technical assistance to organizations and agencies and creates materials and resources to build capacity to address human trafficking at the institutional level. Prior to joining Polaris, Ms. Roofeh was senior county attorney in the New York City Criminal Court, where her work included coordinating for attorneys, judges, and court personnel on issues related to sex trafficking. Full biographies for Audrey and Jennifer will be emailed to you following the webinar, along with a PDF of today's presentation. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Audrey and Jennifer for the substantive portion of our webinar.
Thank you, Charlie. And before we get into the learning objectives, we just wanted to set the context for human trafficking and intimidation. As everyone on this call deeply understands, intimidation and human trafficking are inextricably intertwined. Whether the intimidation is subtle, whether it's coming from a trafficker or from the system or some external forces, or whether it's overt, it is part of the force, the fraud, the coercion, part of the recruitment, the victimization. And traffickers and their allies are experts in obtaining and exploiting the very information that they can use to intimidate and control victims. And many of the factors that enable the recruitment make the victim vulnerable to intimidation. So these are such natural partner crimes to be talking about. And we'll go into much more detail, obviously, in the presentation. The next important piece with respect to intimidation is that because it is so often a crime that co-occurs with domestic violence, sexual assault, labor exploitation, organized crime and gangs, it is easier for traffickers to exploit all the different vulnerabilities and to exert this control to intimidate victims in ways that may not be picked up by allied professionals that are not experts in the other areas, and in fact may be overlooked. So it's important, as we'll emphasize in this presentation and as we always emphasize in our discussions of all the crimes, that individuals are working with, are trained and aware of the dynamics and the different vulnerabilities and the different types of intimidation that are involved in all of these crimes, and are coordinating with experts in these areas to make sure that nobody is overlooked. And the other reason it's important to understand about the dynamics of these crimes is because it's very useful for identifying potential perpetrators and other methods of intimidation. Why are we devoting a webinar to this topic besides the reasons that we have already talked about? Well, obviously, intimidation helps keep victims within the trafficker's control, but it also helps keep future victims within the control, as sometimes simply witnessing either the intimidation itself or the lack of an effective response to it really helps maintain this control. It obviously allows the traffickers to evade accountability. It makes it difficult. It puts up huge roadblocks to the investigation and prosecution of these cases and bringing these perpetrators to justice. And so it's absolutely critical because understanding intimidation helps remove some of the frustration, helps prevent some of the barriers that will stop victims from participating in the prosecution of their traffickers, or alternatively, will help give tools to us so that we can go forward even without a victim's participation. And again, if we allow witness intimidation to go unchecked, it compromises the integrity of the criminal justice process overall. And it's our responsibility to safeguard public safety. And so for these reasons, it's a critical topic. As a result of this webinar, we'll be able to do the following: to understand intimidation and therefore better identify incidents of it, and to prevent it by understanding where the opportunities lie. To understand and be able to employ the strategies necessary during pretrial to identify and respond to intimidation in human trafficking cases. To be able to develop and employ trial strategies during the prosecution of a case that enhance the likelihood of a successful prosecution and that help the prosecutors be flexible in terms of dealing with it. And then to reduce the likelihood of overall intimidation, to help communities better assess and better prepare for ways of preventing traffickers from intimidating victims and ways to better respond to it, more effectively respond to it. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Charlie for a couple of questions.
Yeah, our first question today is, have you been involved in an investigation or prosecution where victims or witnesses were intimidated in any of the following cases? And you can indicate which letter using the feedback option to your left. A, sex trafficking, B, labor trafficking, C, sexual violence, adult or child, and D, domestic violence. Just give folks a few moments to respond. So it does look like the majority of answers that are coming in are going to be A, sex trafficking, with the next highest number of responses being D, domestic violence. And then our next question for you guys is, have victims or witnesses been intimidated in your cases? True or false? So for a lot of you, that has been true. And the next question really is, how did you discover the intimidation when you were, as you were going through your case? What happened? You can private chat those responses to me, and I'll give you guys another moment to respond. Just keep thinking about those cases that you guys have worked on. And you can private chat using the chat box, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and clicking on Charlie Whitman. So it looks like for some folks, you've been directly informed by the victim of intimidation occurring. Through forensics and cell phones, finding out information that way, through interviews with the client, also others close to victims, and then again, direct victim report. So I'll turn it back over to one more response. Again, yes, victims telling me that their lives have been directly threatened. Victim again. So it seems like a lot of you, it's been straight, working with victims. Back over to Jen and Audrey for more case files.
Hi, this is Audrey Roofeh from Polaris Project, and I'm glad to be joining you today. We are going to be using a case file as an example through the course of our discussion. And before we do that, actually, we're going to talk a little bit more about the kinds of intimidation that are seen through these cases, human trafficking. And I can tell you that the experience we have at Polaris Project comes from a couple different venues. And that's how we're informed about these kinds of intimidation. The first is through our operation of the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which is a national hotline. And we get calls in that are tips about human trafficking. They are calls from victims themselves looking for resources, looking for help to leave a trafficking situation, crisis calls, and we try to be able to connect those victims to resources, and we connect people giving us tips to the law enforcement that can investigate it. So this is through our connections throughout the United States. The second source of information on the intimidation of witnesses that we see is through our work with clients directly. We have two offices that provide direct services to survivors of human trafficking here in Washington, D.C., where I am, and also in Newark, New Jersey. So that's where the context comes from for us. And what I can share with you is that we see intimidation as the cornerstone of a trafficker's control over a victim. And this comes through direct threats by the trafficker or using the community around the victim to be able to exploit naivete or language barriers or lack of understanding about a victim's circumstances. We see this with the exploitation of emotional ties that a trafficker might create with the victim if they have had at one point or continue to have a romantic relationship. If there's a child in common, we have seen situations where children are used as a bargaining chip, used for blackmail of victims. And in situations where we're looking at perhaps labor trafficking, you'll hear continual promises of payment for work done. Next month you'll get paid, next month you'll get paid, when it just doesn't happen. And the exploiter is able to take advantage of a victim and continue to keep them working without payment. And you'll see it around immigration status as well. Threats that a victim is told they're in the United States illegally, whether they are or not. If their controller brought them to the United States, they might say, I never filed a visa application for you. You're here illegally. I control all of your movements. If you even speak to law enforcement, you'll be arrested. They'll know who you are. They'll know that you're illegal. And that really continues in the context of misunderstanding of the role of law enforcement. This might be in the context of foreign nationals in the United States, where law enforcement in their home country may not have been people that they would trust. It might have been corrupt. It might have been something where they wouldn't go to law enforcement for any kind of assistance. And when we're looking at U.S. citizen victims, we see that kind of misunderstanding or misconception around law enforcement as well. Threats to call law enforcement and report a trafficking victim claiming that the victim might be a prostitute or that they're here illegally. And this is something that we see quite often. And also threats around the family of victims, that a trafficker will know where the family of a victim is, whether it's in the United States or overseas, and use that information to threaten the victim and their family, whether here or elsewhere. We see things that are very similar to what you might be familiar with in the domestic partner, domestic violence context. Emotional manipulation very much applies. You'll see an almost complete overlap when we're looking at situations where the trafficker is the intimate partner of the victim. So that is a domestic violence situation, and you do see the very similar kinds of exploitation there. And when we're looking at labor trafficking, you see pervasive threats in domestic servitude situations because the victim usually lives with their trafficker, and the trafficker will control every aspect of the victim's life, where and when they eat, when they sleep, with whom they have contact, when they can leave the house, when they can't. And that can make it extremely difficult for a victim to even potentially leave the situation. We see that the threats and intimidation can be subtle and can be complicated, where victims align themselves with the perpetrator of the crime against them or don't see themselves as victims. And that makes it very difficult to support change in that person's life because of those circumstances. So that's quite a lot of what we see in the different circumstances that intimidation occurs. But to put it in some context, it's useful, I think, to look at how trafficking fits as the crime in which intimidation later occurs. So using the action, means, and purpose model of looking at the crime of human trafficking under federal law, human trafficking occurs when the trafficker or controller takes an action, and we've listed them out here: recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining an individual, and then employs the means of force, fraud, coercion for the purpose of compelling a victim to provide commercial sex acts or labor or services. So having one from each bucket, one element from action, means, and purpose will be a trafficking situation. So as the distinction, as you know, is that when we're looking at minors in situations of commercial sex, there is no need to show under federal law that force, fraud, or coercion was used to induce that minor to provide commercial sex. I think it's worthwhile to look at the means portion in a little more depth, because the elements that we see here of force, fraud, and coercion may not stop when a victim makes contact with law enforcement or service provider to help them, because that victim is a commodity to the trafficker, and losing access to the victim means really losing either their labor or services or the money that they're getting from providing commercial sex. So most of us are familiar with force, and we see that through physical assault and sexual assault, other kinds of confinement and isolation. But the fraud element can be very subtle, hard to detect, used very effectively in different kinds of trafficking networks, and can include false promises, situations where a person is told that they will be able to work in a certain job if they come to the United States, and then it turns out that that legitimate job doesn't exist, or it's a job where they're working 16 hours a day, living in the back of the workplace, whether it's a restaurant or nail salon or something else, and they're not getting paid. The withholding of wages, the withholding of documents can come in as well. And then there's also coercion, which is very powerful and very often utilized means for traffickers because it doesn't leave bruises. And it's also hard for a victim to explain to others sometimes. Those threats to themselves, to their family members or others, threats of deportation, debt bondage, when a person is told that to come to the United States, they'll incur a debt for the travel, visa, place to stay, the expenses of using a smuggler, and so on, turn into a situation where they have so much debt that it could never possibly be paid off. And similarly, the kinds of psychological manipulation that comes into play with that kind of coercion, making it very difficult for a person to leave that situation. So I'd like to turn this over to Jen.
Thank you, Audrey. And obviously, when we're listening to the definitions of force, fraud, and coercion, it's easy to see how the elements that would make up the control of a human trafficking victim often track the elements of intimidation, depending on the state or federal statute or its related crimes, or perhaps will make up crimes, as we'll talk about later, or actions, as we'll talk about later, that can be used to establish forfeiture by wrongdoing in terms of stripping, if you will, not stripping the defendant of his or her constitutional rights, but having the defendant not be able to raise that as a shield. But before we go into the details of intimidation and human trafficking, I think it's important that we take a step back to just look at intimidation a little bit more generally. And what the information I'm going to present now on intimidation is applicable to human trafficking, but other crimes as well. The bottom line is that accurate statistics on witness intimidation are very hard to come by. Part of this is obviously due to the difficulty of identifying and interviewing witnesses who are the subject of the most effective crimes, the most effective forms of intimidation. As we know, intimidation, when it's successful, we often don't learn about it, or we learn about it too late when a witness or victim has been killed. The studies that have been done on intimidation involve samples of victims and witnesses in a single jurisdiction over a discrete period of time. And nevertheless, we can learn something from that. And that's police and prosecutors frequently do identify witness intimidation or witness reluctance or witnesses' refusal to participate as a significant problem in going forward with a crime. And this is particularly true in domestic violence and gang-related violence based on the research, but I would posit that the reason it hasn't been documented in the research on human trafficking cases as frequently is because this is a crime that we're just starting to invest the time and resources in looking at all of these areas. And there are some good studies, though, on intimidation in Brooklyn. They're older, though, and some other places that shed some light on it. What I'm showing you now is a figure from a forthcoming publication by AEquitas and the Justice Management Institute on intimidation. And this is a conceptual model to try and capture the prevalence of intimidation, because the first step towards detecting it is understanding just how widespread it is. As I mentioned in the earlier slide, by its nature, it's very difficult to identify unless it's unsuccessful or only partially successful. And so there's no real way to determine how often it succeeds in preventing crime reporting or cooperation with the prosecution, because it's very hard to capture a negative. And this really puts us all at a disadvantage, because if we don't have a way to measure what the actual incidence of intimidation is in a community, it's very difficult for individual prosecutors and police officers or communities to determine if any response is going to be effective at decreasing intimidation and enhancing the safety of victims. And so, left in this state of limbo, people can be spinning their wheels. And so this model was created by Franklin Cruz. He's one of the individuals in the acknowledgments to try and capture the idea that the opportunities for intimidation would be this outside circle that are much larger that we actually have the ability to grasp, and certainly larger than we're detecting right now. The smallest circle is the documented incidents of witness intimidation, and that's how many incidents are actually documented. And as I mentioned in the earlier slides, the studies we have, there are older studies on witness intimidation. But this model was developed using information from 3 different pilot sites in which Rhonda Martinson and John Wilkinson of AEquitas worked, and Franklin Cruz. And in talking with everyone, the idea of the model was developed that if we could try and bring the documented incidents up, if you will, to actually match what was happening, we might get close to determining what the actual incidence of witness intimidation is. And the only way to increase documentation is to really be able to train police and law enforcement and allied professionals to teach victims to understand and identify witness intimidation, to understand that it can be very subtle, that it is often minimized, and also to teach the allied professionals and prosecutors to teach themselves and to train their colleagues what intimidation is, so that when it's reported or when it's observed, it's not overlooked. And this publication is pending approval now and should be forthcoming within the next few weeks and will be available on the AEquitas website. The next graphic here is to set the frame for as we go into the case file. And I know it's a little bit hard to read the way that it is on the screen right now, unless it's your main screen. But in essence, what it is a map of all of the different opportunities for intimidation in the system. Now, obviously, all of us know what, all of us in the criminal justice system understand that there is a large piece of, what happens before an incident and what happens through arrest. But what this map is doing, and this was also developed by Franklin Cruz, it helps show the different phases to illustrate the common opportunities for intimidation throughout the life of a criminal case. And this is from the commission of the crime through the completion of an offender's sentence, whether that offender is in custody or under community supervision. And so it's within this framework that we really want to have in mind when we look at human trafficking cases to figure out what is happening in a community with perpetrators, with us as allied professionals, before a crime is even committed, to intimidate victims, both the current victim and future victims from coming forward. And it's helpful for us to use as a guide to detect the intimidation on cases that we actually have, so that we can ensure that we can see where the opportunities for intimidation are, that we can keep the victim safe and supported at the places where they're at the most risk for intimidation, that we can prepare to litigate appropriate motions. We can determine witness order. We can inform the court of opportunities. So it's very helpful in that way. And finally, it's helpful for policymakers. As we'll talk at the end of this presentation, all of us, whether we're on the line actually investigating or prosecuting these cases, or whether we're developing policy in the office or in our community, or both, we want to play a part in making sure our community is decreasing opportunities for intimidation in human trafficking cases and most effectively responding to them when they do occur. And so for that reason, this map is very important in terms of analyzing the fact pattern. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Charlie, who I think is going to discuss one of the questions.
Hi, everyone. So we do have a question coming up on whether or not the victim in this fact pattern we provided you with today, or any witness in the case, is at risk of intimidation, and if so, at what point do you think that might be? And you can go ahead and private chat those answers to me, and I'll share those with the group. And for those of you who might not have had the opportunity to read the fact pattern, I'm just going to briefly go through what information there is. So there's a woman who works on the cleaning staff. So on August 29, 2013, police received a call from a law firm associate, Leslie, working at her office. And she said that a woman who works on the cleaning staff, her name is Sophie, I think, and she's around 30 years old. I work late a lot, so I've gotten to know her and some of the other cleaning staff. At first, we just said hello to each other, and she was pretty quiet, but she always seemed happy, upbeat, albeit tired. She said she worked some other jobs. After a few weeks, we started talking about our jobs and our families, and Sophie said she had just moved to the area for this job and that she was staying at company housing. She said the move was very expensive, and she needed the job to help pay off some money she borrowed. Some days when Sophie came in, she seemed extremely tired, but she was always really energetic, despite the fact that she looked like she hadn't slept in a while. She always worked Monday through Thursday, and then one day she just didn't come in. A guy who told me his name was Mike, and he was the head of the cleaning crew for our building, took her shift. When I asked Mike where Sophie was, he said she was sick that night. He then asked me if I was friends with her and how much we talked. I can't explain it, but I felt uncomfortable with his question, the tone of it, something. When Sophie didn't show up the next night, I made sure I worked late every Monday through Thursday night just so I could try to see her, just to make sure she was okay. She didn't show up for 3 more weeks, and then I worked late on a Friday night, and she was there. I was so ecstatic I hugged her. She told me she had been hit by somebody she works with and had to go to the hospital, but because she was afraid to get anybody in trouble, she told the hospital that she had been mugged. I looked at her carefully, trying to see scars or something, but as usual, she was wearing long sleeves and pants. She didn't want to talk about the assault, just to say that she had gotten pretty badly hurt and that everything was okay. So thank you all so much. I'm seeing a lot of participation here. It looks like, any witness or victims are at risk. As some comments coming in. Sophie and Leslie both seem like they're going to be at risk here. And then, so one issue that's come in is maybe not necessarily specifically answering the question, but seeing media and newspapers identifying victims from law enforcement records, if it was a supposed mugging and how that could be considered unintentional intimidation. Yes, again, Leslie is at risk. And that the fact that the male was questioning how much she talked and the fact that the abuse was already occurring is also a risk of intimidation. And the witness is at risk if she feels responsible for her injuries after the questioning by the male. And so thank you all so much for your responses. And we want to provide you with a little bit additional information going forward so you can keep looking at this case. And on Monday, Leslie works late again and convinces Sophie to call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline from her office. Sophie says she doesn't want to get anybody in trouble, but she'd like to get some help because she isn't getting paid what she was promised. She doesn't have access to any legal documents and is living in a place that's not safe with other people like her. On Wednesday evening, Leslie leaves her firm at 11:30. When she gets to her car, she finds that her door is unlocked and the glove compartment contents strewn onto the front passenger seat. Nothing appears to be missing. So Leslie contacts the police to make a report, but because there's no sign of forced entry and nothing's been taken, she's told there's nothing that can be done and no report is taken. She's unnerved and believes that the break-in is related to her communication with Sophie. However, the police don't take a report and they tell her to call 911 if there's evidence of a crime. So a question for you guys, considering all these additional facts, is this incident related to Leslie's interaction with Sophie? Do you think that it is? And pardon my moment. There you go, and you can, select answers A, definitely yes, B, definitely no, C, more likely than not, or D, I don't know. And as you're answering those questions, another question that's going to come up soon is, what do you think are the challenges to responding to this type of incident? And you can go ahead and, again, private chat those answers to me. What's going to be challenging about responding to Leslie's car break-in? And it does look like, a good majority of you, probably about 48% say more likely than not this is related to Leslie's interactions with Sophie. About 37% are saying definitely yes. And then with about 17% saying you're just not sure. So again, the question is, what are the challenges in responding to this incident, considering you really do think more likely than not these are related? I'll give you guys a few minutes to respond again. So one answer is definitely yes, because it sounds like nothing like this ever happened to her before her contact with Sophie. So that's, going back to that previous multiple choice question. As far as what are the challenges, there isn't any evidence to point to a connection between the break-in and Sophie. And law enforcement is not likely going to be motivated to act in a situation where there's little evidence, particularly if they don't often deal with traffickers. It's a good point identifying the trafficking. And it shows the victim that she can't really trust law enforcement and that she may feel that she's overanalyzing just some of the problems that are going to come off as a consequence to this problem. And then one participant has said that you need to start documenting incidents like this that happen. These are really great responses to everybody. Again, no direct evidence, no specific threat. The same things that make it effective intimidation make it difficult to prove anything. Again, same answers, no evidence. Proving who broke into the car and that relationship to Sophie. Proof, over and over again we're seeing that response proof. And so again, what's the impact of not responding to this incident? One answer we had was that it's going to send the message to the victim that nothing that she does is really going to help stop. Another answer to this question could be that it's going to make that witness less likely to report future incidents because of a lack of response. And you can keep those answers coming, and we'll share them as they come in. Just to provide a little bit additional information for you guys on this case is that additional information. FBI Agent Abel and City Police Detective McGrath locate Sophie and briefly interview her in the car close to Leslie's office. Sophie discusses the assault but will not identify the assailant and say it might have been an accident. She does tell the police at which hospital she received treatment. During the interview, she starts to cry and tells police she's begging them to let her go back to work or she's going to get in trouble. They apologize, explain they only want to help, and hand her business cards that say Layla City Nails with their phone numbers listed. Leslie doesn't see Sophie again, but Mike starts working the early morning shift and tells Leslie that Sophie requested a move to a different building so she could work extra shifts and weekends. And I just want to, provide one more participant response before I pass the torch back over to Audrey and Jen, and says that a consequence of this incident not going reported is that the trafficking is going to continue to take place and possibly make things worse. So back to you guys.
Thanks. And actually, before I go, Audrey, I wondered if you could just talk for a moment about the additional evidence on the previous slide, the slide 2 before this, where the police gave the card about Layla City Nails. And I know that everyone on this line is probably very experienced with human trafficking, but can you just talk a little bit about some efforts underway with law enforcement that you work with that help to undercut intimidation?
Sure. I can tell you, and like Jen said, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with wanting to make sure that victims feel like they are safe in communicating with people who might be able to help them, specifically law enforcement or service providers, and things that don't identify that the potential victim has been communicating with people that the trafficker would not want the victim to communicate with, like law enforcement or service providers, meaning that they will end up providing information that has an innocuous explanation for why a victim has a business card for a nail salon rather than for a city detective. Similarly, with service providers, you will see situations where in the course of connecting with potential victims, they might have a chapstick or a compact mirror that has a phone number on it. It doesn't identify the phone number as being the service provider's, but one that the victim can hold on to for when they find it the right time for them to communicate and ask for help. And in an example that we're going to go into a little later on, taken from a composite of calls that we received from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, we see that victims will take quite a long time before they feel that they're ready to be able to take such a big step, knowing that their trafficker would punish them severely for communicating with a service provider or with law enforcement. So having that information handy, but in a way that is safe for a victim to hold on to, it can be very important for being able to make that connection with you and with your colleagues when they're ready to speak.
Thank you, Audrey. And obviously, as we all know, even the most disorganized criminals do maintain communication with each other. So obviously, law enforcement and prosecutors who work in this area, talk about varying it up and changing it up a little bit because, if you're handing out Layla's nails, people will know exactly what that is, and that information will get passed on. So the general premise, obviously, of this entire session is that the better information about opportunities and type of intimidation and its various forms will improve our ability to identify it, to prepare for it, to prevent victims from being intimidated, and to help victims identify. So just in the initial facts that we get, and sometimes understanding that if reports are made, they may be very, bare-bone reports with very little information, such as Leslie's reports. If she were to call this in to either the hotline or talk to the police about anything that she knew, certainly there's no hard evidence of a crime, but if this sheet came in front, there are certainly indicators that we can all look at and recognize to determine either that there has been intimidation or some sort of retaliation in the case, or that it's information that we want to follow up on. So in addition to the general dynamics of human trafficking that Audrey talked about earlier and the different methods of control, understanding the overlap of these crimes means that, for all we know, Sophie and Mike can be in some sort of relationship, or there may be an intimate partner. It can be, two partners where one is trafficking the other. In terms of Sophie's disappearance for a while, the assault may have been perpetrated by other victims or other individuals that were part of the trafficking ring as retaliation for her even talking to Leslie. If that information came out, she could have been made an example of. The assault could have been physical or sexual. What we know about these crimes and other crimes is that the disclosure happens over a process, so we want to think about that, take note of it. Just the fact that Sophie was vague with the details, it's something to think about and perhaps follow up with later. The appearance of Mike as both a signal to Sophie and as a signal to Leslie and perhaps any other intervener, either as a sign of legitimacy or perhaps with this incident that happened at 11:30, a sign of, if it's not intimidating someone, it certainly might, even if Leslie doesn't connect it to the situation with Sophie, it might make her more hesitant to work late at night, so therefore she's not a witness or isn't going to interact with any other victims. It might make her distracted if something is taken or if she's concerned her identity or something is taken, so it can serve as a distraction. And or it might, she might actually perceive it as a threat and not want to go forward, and the subsequent inability of the system to really respond to it effectively, or their lack of response in this particular case, can stop her from intervening. And the movement of Sophie to a later shift, or a different shift, a different building, could be another attempt to isolate her. It could be a movement out of the labor trafficking situation and into sex trafficking as punishment, or as just the normal course or evolution of the human trafficking. So all of these things, to think about as we get the cases in front of us so that we can do the extra investigation that's necessary. The next slide is a graphic, and this is from our prosecutor's resource on witness intimidation that was developed by Terry Garvey, who is an AEquitas attorney advisor. And it's a resource that really helps. It's not human trafficking specific. It's relevant to all the crimes that we handle and really outside of our crimes. But the steps that are here to obviously help identify witness intimidation and respond to it in a case, but also with the eye that if we do this, we'll help prevent it in the future. So in doing so, obviously the goal in practice should be to educate victims so that they're able to recognize intimidation and can report it, so that we as allied professionals are educated, we can recognize it, we don't minimize or dismiss it. And it's broken up into 3 steps so that we can, look at it very carefully in terms of what to do at the first steps to figure out if it happened or if your victim is at risk of it. And then as a case progresses through pretrial, specific strategies that we can take, and we're going to discuss all of these in turns. And then again at trial, what to do so that you're flexible enough to address intimidation if it hasn't come up yet, and what to do if you've got intimidation that has been reported or documented or you have evidence of, how to integrate it into the case so that you can better explain to the fact finder this control and all of the different elements that can be so hard. We've seen this in domestic violence cases. We see it in human trafficking cases. If, in this case, it seems that Sophie has actually been assaulted, but in cases where there isn't an overt assault or we don't have the evidence of that yet, why do individuals stay? What is the control mechanism? And so just the understanding of intimidation and how it works in a human trafficking case can make us better able to try these cases. And I'd like to just make one point before I turn this back over to Audrey, that again, as I talked about, there are several specific stages and specific steps that can be taken when we're looking at a case. Something to think about is that there are efforts that could help facilitate the steps online. First, obviously, we know opportunities for intimidation occur well before an incident is reported. In fact, perpetrators can silence their communities well in advance of an incident. I think the clearest examples of this are with gangs and other violent criminals. But And we know that in several violent neighborhoods, residents are generally reluctant to report crimes or cooperate with law enforcement because they may fear retaliation. But that's not just in violent neighborhoods. That can happen in communities and neighborhoods anywhere where people are afraid of community hostility or other sorts of retaliation. And it's important then to think about the perpetrator's status outside of just being a criminal or violent, but if someone has a status, if they're either a member of law enforcement or of high status in the community, or they have an actual or perceived relationship with law enforcement, how are we as allied professionals breaking down the barrier that that status might be creating so that communities are afraid to report, they don't feel comfortable that their reports will be taken seriously, followed up, or that they won't be retaliated against? How can we fight that? And so in many ways of just taking these steps, it really levels the playing field so that we're responding evenly. And again, it just highlights the importance, all of this, of coordinated coordinated responses, community policing, all of these initiatives that connect us with the community. And the next piece is the training, which we've talked about already, the training in terms of understanding what intimidation is and how to detect it, the training to understand how important it is to have policies and protocol in place that protects the identities of informants or any reporter of a crime. Obviously, we have discovery applications, but we could have tip lines set up or all the other things that we do to help make it safe for people to report. And again, just responding to this quickly. And so these are some of the things that will facilitate the steps that can be taken in one. And now I would like to turn it back over to Audrey.
Thanks, Jen. I'd like to add on to a point that Jen raised, which is that looking at who the possible perpetrator is of the crime can be surprising. And we see this when the defendants or perpetrators have a lot of power and standing in their community. In the D.C. metropolitan area, we see situations of domestic servitude where the perpetrators of the crime are wealthy foreign nationals living in the United States who have employed nannies, housekeepers, and so on, and are we're not talking about street-level pimps, but people against whom it might be a challenge or something very different in looking at the perpetrators of crimes, and also putting it in the cultural context for separate situations and how difficult it can be for victims to speak out against a person who has that kind of power in their community, possibly even the power in their community back home where their families are, that they would be seen as ungrateful for not accepting the circumstances that they're living in, despite it being a violation of their rights in the United States. But I want to move on and address some of the issues that were listed in the last slide, but that we'll get into in more detail here, looking at whether victims are at risk for intimidation in the first place or continued intimidation. And that can mean conducting a risk assessment for that victim. And what we're seeing is that in criminal cases, the strongest indicator for the risk of intimidation is a prior history of intimidation by a defendant towards this victim or others, as well as the defendant's prior criminal history. And the factors there to consider are whether a defendant has previously been charged with violent crimes or crimes involving intimidation. Does that defendant have access to weapons? Does the defendant or the victim have a drug or alcohol problem or possible mental health issues? Is there a history of dropped charges, restraining orders, or the dismissal of cases where the victim or witness failed to appear? Does the defendant or his or her allies have power or authority over the victim or witnesses? This can be in a gang context or in a pimp-based situation. And how fearful is the victim, and what is that fear based on? So understanding those human trafficking dynamics that might cause fear. And we will get into in more detail how important it is to be able to communicate effectively with a victim who does have that very real fear in that situation. Additionally, looking at how serious the crimes are that the defendant has been charged with, and what's the potential sentencing exposure. But as you can imagine, victims are very often accurate judges of how dangerous the offender would be to them, and what would be likely to escalate the violence against them. So also, defendants who have more at stake, who might be more desperate to avoid criminal consequences, might be more likely to resort to intimidation. And we're going to talk now a little bit about safety planning. And I know that a lot of people who are participating and watching today's webinar have experience providing safety planning and providing services or working with service providers on cases where there's a victim who does need help. So if people have thoughts as we're talking about safety planning, about what works in their experience, maybe you can chat that to Charlie, and we can share that as we're going along. But to talk about the importance of safety planning, it really goes back to the idea that the victim is a commodity to the trafficker, and it's very hard for the victim to be able to start a relationship with law enforcement that completely cuts that trafficker out of his or her life without cutting out the other elements of their life experience. They might be living with that trafficker. They might have a relationship that's romantic, or it might be one where the work context requires the control of the trafficker over the living situation. So there's a lot to think about there for safety for the victim. So you're thinking about identifying the areas where the victim is vulnerable, and that can be on the internet with Facebook and other social networking sites, where and how they communicate, whether they have a child in common, whether they have pets that the defendant might try and harm. So you're thinking about all the different things, and we'll get into where a trove of resources on safety planning can be found. But you want to identify who the person is who will be working on safety planning with the victim. It can be a service provider. Is it you? Is it the victim witness coordinator? So you're thinking about a lot of those pieces. And it can be in two different settings, thinking about safety planning before a victim is able to leave a trafficking situation or after. So before a victim leaves the situation, they want to have information stored with them, memorized phone numbers of the people they need to reach in case of an emergency, a list for what they should take with them. As somebody mentioned to Charlie earlier, you want to document kinds of intimidation that's happening. If there's anything that's happening along those lines, any documentation that a victim has of the abuse, any records about their abuse, whether it's a failure payment or any kinds of payment that shows that a person was paid much less than they should have been paid, are things that it would be good for a victim to be able to hold on to before they escape a trafficking situation, and it certainly would be of assistance in conducting a prosecution afterwards. So they want to have that checklist of items to hold on to before they leave, a point of contact for when they're ready to go, and then have a safety plan for what they should do after exiting a human trafficking situation. And I can tell you that when victims call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center trying to leave a trafficking situation, that's something that we're able to assist them with by putting them in touch with law enforcement that can conduct an extraction, or connecting them when they're ready to leave with a service provider if they're able to leave safely and on their own. So those are pieces to consider. Additionally, there obviously orders of protection, that would be important. And once a person has left, changing their locks, changing their phone number, having a separate safety plan for any child in that situation. And that's a small part of what safety planning looks like for a potential victim. And there's quite a lot of information available on the internet that would be helpful for someone planning out safety planning with a victim. And that's, for instance, at womenslaw.org. And also by calling our hotline, where you can speak with a call specialist about the safety planning possibilities for different settings that a victim might be in. So I'm wondering, for the cases that you're working on, who works on safety planning with witnesses? Is it, and you can press the feedback button here, is it A, the victim witness coordinator in your office if you have one? Is it the prosecutors? Do you connect with a local service provider? Or is there no one who does work on this with victims? And if you have somebody who does this who isn't listed on A through D, private chat that to Charlie Whitten, and she'll give us the sense of what your answers are on this. So if you want to take a second.
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. So it looks like about 63% of you so far are saying service providers are the people safety planning with witnesses. We also have a response about law enforcement as well. It provides safety planning. Sometimes prosecutors and victim witness coordinators will work together on safety planning. Law enforcement again, but again, it can be a combination of the people that we have listed here.
Audrey, is it okay if I'm so sorry, Charlie and Audrey, I just want to jump in. It's Jennifer. To also just remind folks that for prosecutors, if you are doing bail motions or conditions of release, that this is a place where you can, not quite safety planning, but obviously you can take into consideration the safety of the victim and put into place some provisions there.
And we had one other participant, sorry, Audrey, that also said that in human trafficking cases, that this office has also safety planned with Polaris.
That's great to hear. I love it. But I'm also really heartened to hear from you, Charlie, that you said about 60% of people found that working with service providers was how they did their safety planning. That's what we find to be very effective. And I'm going to walk you through now giving an example of somebody, this is a composite you're seeing on your screen, of calls that we received to the NHTRC and what a victim's circumstances are like and why it's important to work with a service provider once they connect with law enforcement on the needs of that victim. So I'm going to read this out to you. This is the situation of somebody named Dorothy who came to the U.S. from South America. She's working as a nanny for a wealthy family. And when she came to the U.S., she was given a Know Your Rights pamphlet from the State Department that had the NHTRC phone number on it. And, she kept it with her, and she called the hotline one day to talk about the people she was working for. She said that her family took the documents that she had, her visa and her passport. She hadn't been allowed to leave the home very much, maybe once or twice over the last few months, and wasn't allowed to interact with anyone besides her employers. She was told by her employers that it was acceptable to get paid much, much less than what was listed in her contract, maybe about a third of what she was promised. And the hotline offered to connect Dorothy with a service provider and with trusted law enforcement if she wanted to leave. But Dorothy said she needed the money to send to her family back home, and she didn't know what to do because she couldn't speak English very well, and the thought of leaving the home was too much for her. So she didn't know what to do, and she didn't do anything that first time she called the NHTRC, except that she made that call, which was a big step for her. over the course of a few months, she called the hotline back often. She wasn't happy with her situation, but she didn't want to get her employers in trouble because she did think that they were doing her a favor and that they did treat her well. And what happened was the hotline just continued to provide support and let her know what her options are, and that she knew that when she was ready, if she ever was ready, the hotline would be there to help. So one footnote there is that we are a trauma-informed, victim-centered hotline, and when someone calls us who says, I'm not ready to leave, we don't tell them they have to leave their situation, whatever it is, but provide support, answer the questions that a person wants answered. But eventually, for Dorothy, she called the hotline and said she was ready to go. So we contacted the law enforcement in her area that also works with a service provider, and we're able to connect Dorothy with a victim advocate and a case manager at that service provider who helped her with reporting her situation, getting her shelter, and providing the services that she needed when her whole life was working with this family. Everything she owned was in that house. She didn't have access to her documents, and when she left, she had to flee. So with whatever she was able to grab, she left. So when you think about that, you want to be able to have a victim who can work with law enforcement in prosecuting the family for labor trafficking. So in order for her to be a strong witness, she would need to have her needs met. And those are going to be the most basic needs, from food and shelter to documents. She wouldn't be able to prove that she's in the country legally at all. She'd no proof of her identity. And that's something that service providers that help with case management and coordination can do in the course of helping a person get on their feet and be able to assist the prosecution in a case that they're trying to bring. So what we see is that, and I've taken this information from a really fantastic resource that I would suggest to everyone on this webinar, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center treatise on representing survivors of human trafficking. It's absolutely fantastic. And in it, Ivy Lee and Lynette Parker talk about the 4 stages of a victim's needs. So when we're looking at somebody in Dorothy's situation, you first have the emergency crisis intervention, the moment where she's extracted from her trafficking situation. She needs protection immediately, and she needs to have the help of both law enforcement, but also a service provider, somebody in either context who can help her talk through what happened, and then provide her with the emergency shelter that she needs, with food and clothing, because she won't have the things that beyond what she can take with her. And moving from there is the non-emergent crisis stage. And that's the shift from the adrenaline-filled leaving the trafficking situation to what can include boredom and inactivity or loneliness. And her life will have changed tremendously, but it doesn't mean that somebody like Dorothy is quite on her feet. Maybe she can't work in the U.S. legally or even get a job if she wanted to. She may be in 90-day shelter or long-term shelter, but she doesn't have a place of her own, and she might want to set up an apartment of her own. So that's not something that a prosecutor with a caseload can really focus on, but that would be the role of the service provider working with law enforcement to make sure that Dorothy is moving forward from that crisis to non-emergent crisis to stabilization, where Dorothy would be building her healthy life skills, maybe avoiding exploitative situations in the future. And for that, she would need to have an apartment or some kind of home situation of her own. We'll talk a little bit later about the needs for immigration remedies if the victim is a foreign national, and being able to work in the country legally, and moving from there to the integration stage where she's self-sufficient, where she has healthy relationships and permanent housing. Maybe her family members have received derivative T or U visas and are able to live with her in the United States. But for all of these pieces, you see that there are needs that can't be met solely by one person or by law enforcement, but really in collaboration, law enforcement and service providers, to make sure that the victim witness is healthy, stable, feels secure, feels safe, and able then to assist law enforcement in the prosecution of the trafficker. So in supporting victims, everything that you see up on this list are things that victims need, whether at the emergency stage all the way into stabilization and integration. And if you don't already have a service provider that you work with in your area, we would love it if you gave us a call at the National Human Trafficking Resource Center to be able to connect with the people in your city or state who are working on human trafficking cases. It can be looking for a service provider who does certain kinds of work, working with certain victim populations. It can also be looking for peer-to-peer support on certain kinds of trafficking cases. We've gotten calls in the past where law enforcement that have worked on a case that was new to them, maybe it was around human trafficking in residential brothels with certain ethnic groups, looking for kind of that peer-to-peer support from other law enforcement somewhere else in the country that have had experience working with it. So we're able to connect our law enforcement contacts, our service provider contacts for peer-to-peer support with training materials and with direct connections for victims, both through our phone number, which you see there, and our text line at 233-733. So I want you to be able to use us as a resource. So I'm going to turn this
Thank you, Audrey. Oh, thanks, Audrey. So at this point, most of this graphic really relates to the prosecutor's piece, but I'd ask while I'm pointing out and highlighting some issues, if folks would like to chat, private chat to Charlie, different ways that law enforcement, allied service providers, and others on the call, healthcare, can contribute in these areas during the pretrial period or in other areas not listed, we'd be very interested. I want to highlight in the first piece about alerting the trial judge about either actual or potential intimidation. Obviously, the rules around doing this and the defense has to be brought in. There are still ways to protect the victim and the identity and the private information by the use of motions and protective orders to deny or delay certain discovery in order to handle this. Many judges are quite versed in intimidation in creating courtrooms where they are taking proactive steps to prevent intimidation, some of the more common, preventing cell phones and having court staff trained to really observe and listen. But some other places are, don't really have this on their radar as much when it's not a high-profile gang or other case where intimidation is really going to be more obvious. So don't take it for granted. There are fantastic resources out there, but one of the best that we have used is a bench book from Pennsylvania for the judges, created by judges. And I point that out because having judges take leadership on this issue is important, and particularly in human trafficking, but in all cases. The other piece I really wanted to highlight too is the, expediting the disposition of a case. It's, a trade comment that justice delayed is justice denied, but it is true, and particularly where the risk of intimidation is high. In any case, it's so important to get, once the case is pulled together, to make sure that the unnecessary delays are objected to. There are several good arguments that can be made, many of which are grounded in the rules of ethics and professional responsibility. And certainly I would ask people to reach out to AEquitas or others to help craft those motions. And in terms of the ongoing and investigation piece, documenting recantations, interviewing everybody, family, friends, even someone like Leslie here who doesn't have specific information. Spending the time to sit down and take the information that Leslie does have is a critical piece of the puzzle that's so often lost because our peers or colleagues may not have the same training that we do on a case. So really sitting and talking and making sure that everyone's on the same page. Monitoring jail communications. And I know resources are so scarce, but many, even smaller jurisdictions, have figured out ways of monitoring these calls, of having the calls shared by between the jail and the DAs so that it's easier to listen and to identify instances where intimidation has been used. Again, this is an area where training is so critical so that one understands the difference between intimidation that can form the elements of a crime. And again, some jurisdictions have great intimidation laws where the actions can be fairly vague to establish intimidation. It's just interfering with a case. Others, the actions and words themselves may not establish intimidation, but as we discussed earlier and as we'll discuss in a little bit more detail later, they can establish forfeiture by wronging. They can be evidence of interference in a case and perhaps lead to the admissibility of a statement from a victim who's now unavailable that would not otherwise have been admissible and now is. And then preserving this evidence. Not only evidence that we have in our possession, but training the victims to preserve it as well. Victim safety is, of course, paramount. And we already talked about areas where we can charge intimidation, and there are strategic reasons for this, too. If intimidation is charged, obviously we want to do it for good ethical reasons, but when you have intimidation charged in a case, that allows you to bring in other evidence. That if intimidation wasn't charged, you would have to try and admit through a motion in limine, a motion to admit other bad acts, or in some other way. So there are good benefits to a trial strategy, to having these charges. But it's important for accountability. It's important for getting appropriate conditions set. It's important not only for this case, but for future cases, and of course, to keep the victim safe. What we have on the screen now is a quote from a study that the Urban Institute did on human trafficking and the challenge of victim cooperation. And it's just one example of the barriers that victims face, obviously, whether it is intimidation or whether it's, the more subtle forms, the more dynamics that are like domestic violence, where the abuse is intermingled with love and other emotional bonds, or where the perpetrator has exploited abuse and isolation and the lack of family ties of an individual. But at the core of pretrial preparation, we always have to have at the forefront of our mind that our victims' participation may cease. And so just preparing, having your forfeiture by wrongdoing files, having your evidence documented, anything we can do so that we can try and go forward even where the victim may not be able to participate with us. There's some additional information here, which is that, and now Sophie calls the detective, Detective McGrath, who was one of the individuals who interviewed her, to say that she came to the U.S. to work at this job. So we've added the element of the fact that she's not, she's not a citizen, and perhaps, and not here legally, perhaps. And it raises the immigration issues that Audrey referred to, but I also thought it would give us the opportunity for Audrey to go back to discuss a little bit the T&U visa process, and we also had a particular comment on this and what important tools and resources this is to help victims who may face the fact that they either are here illegally or they believe that they are because their trafficker has told them that. This would be a good tool. Could you comment on this a little bit, Audrey?
Sure. Yeah, I'd also like to hear what the comment was. Did you say that somebody wanted to share?
Someone did have a comment, and I can chat it. Someone wrote to Charlie because she chatted it to me. At work, we help victims with U visas and violent self-petitions under immigration law. My boss has never had trafficking victims in the 12 years that she's been there, so it's obviously a huge issue. I'm paraphrasing now. And that the education about T visas and U visas and continued presence would be great for service providers. and just understanding this type of immigration relief. And we have on this slide a source to talk about this, but Audrey, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I think that is a fantastic point, and it's something that we see when we give trainings and presentations. Are people who've worked on this, who might have been working on immigration needs for a long time or domestic violence in the immigration context, and just say, we don't see trafficking. And it's something where knowing what questions to ask and knowing what subtle differences there are might make the difference between seeing trafficking and seeing the eligible crimes for U visas. But I am going to chat everyone in a moment a link to another webinar that is exclusively dealing with the immigration remedies for foreign national victims of trafficking. But to give you just a brief sense of what T visas and U visas look like here, we're talking about immigration remedies for foreign national victims. T visas are specific to people who are victims of human trafficking. This is something that means that when a person applies for a T visa, they might be able to have family members also apply for derivative visas. They would need to show that victim would need to show their status as a victim of human trafficking, that they're assisting law enforcement in the investigation or prosecution of human trafficking, but I would put an asterisk at the end there about that cooperation when we're talking about minors. There are visas issued annually. I can't remember what the cutoff is. I think it's 5,000 annually, but I'm sure there's someone here who could correct me on that. When we're looking at U visas, that's another immigration remedy. Again, that's a non-immigrant visa, and that's available to foreign nationals who have been victims of specific enumerated crimes, and that does include human trafficking. A person who is given a U visa can stay in the U.S. For up to 4 years. That's the same for a T visa, and they can also, same with the T visa, apply for permanent resident status after 3 years. Derivative visas, they're also allowed, and the number of T visas used to be, the number of U visas issued used to be capped at 10,000, and then they hit the cap, and I believe it was raised, but it's something that is also a remedy available for victims of human trafficking, but also of related crimes. So yes, 5,000 T visas, 10,000 U visas issued annually. And similarly, there are other kinds of support that is available for foreign national victims. That can be continued presence, which is a temporary immigration status to individuals who are identified by law enforcement as victims of human trafficking, so that they can stay in the U.S. temporarily during an ongoing investigation. And it's initially granted for a year and can be renewed in 1-year increments. That's temporary, and for each of these different forms of immigration relief, different kinds of agencies may be or may not be eligible to work with a victim to provide that relief. So in some instances, we're looking at local law enforcement or labor employment law agencies that can work on these kinds of relief, and others where it has to be federal law enforcement exclusively. Similarly, you see Violence Against Women Act self-petitions as an immigration remedy, special immigrant juvenile status for victims who are under 18, and there's also asylum and refugee status, but that's something that needs to be addressed in far greater detail. So I'm going to share a link with you and turn this back over to Jen.
Thanks so much, Audrey. So in the next few slides, just again, some tools to facilitate the pretrial work. This is a chart we use frequently. It's a pretty simple tool, but it's a very useful and effective one in helping to digest the evidence in what are very complicated cases. You know, even if these cases don't involve complex financial transactions, there can be evidence coming from different sources, and it can be very sometimes without putting it all down, we may feel that we don't have as strong a case as we do. So it's good also to see the relationship of the evidence to an element or elements of the crime that helps us determine the strength of our case, to identifying the type of evidence we have and the source or sources where it comes from. We may think we only have the victim on one particular thing, but we actually have different sources for the same evidence. It's also an important tool that helps us understand where the victim participation is particularly critical, so that where it's uncertain, and again, as we talked about, victim participation cannot be taken for granted. This may let us know when we really have to make sure that we are planning and litigating motions and motions in limine. The second piece in terms of pretrial, again, is expert testimony, figuring out if you're in a jurisdiction where it's been admissible in a human trafficking case. Again, expert testimony is admissible in some form on victim behavior and on dynamics in all 50 states, but it's just a matter of knowing whether or not you have a reported case on human trafficking or on these particular co-related crimes, whether you're going to have to go or whether you're going to have to file a motion to really explain why it should be entered in. They're fairly commonplace, but there is still some pushback, particularly in states like Pennsylvania, which has the newest expert testimony law. But even still, working with experts, someone like Audrey or others, can really help, again, look at these dynamics and help us understand which pieces that we may be unfamiliar with could be intimidation. And so it's just something to think about as we're going forward. The other two pieces that are so critical in pretrial deal with, again, these issues of Crawford and forfeiture by wrongdoing, which these relate to the admissibility of out-of-court statements. And as everyone knows, these are topics in which thousands of pages and cases themselves have been devoted, and it would take a webinar in itself to go through it. But in summary, Crawford and its progeny are a line of cases which analyze the admissibility of out-of-court statements at trial. They're based on the Sixth Amendment, and they hinge on the determination of whether a statement was made to a government actor and whether that information was reported to communicate an ongoing emergency or to report a crime. Like I said, there have been literally thousands of cases interpreting this, including 5 Supreme Court cases, which have looked at the different testimony and written pieces. And the most important piece is to, again, look at the fact that a victim in a human trafficking case, like domestic violence, like sexual violence, like all of the cases in which this is co-occurring, this victim's disclosure is going to be a process. They may disclose to many people, and it may be important to look at the statements and determine whether these statements are barred by hearsay or whether there's a Crawford objection to them. And if there is, this is a place where understanding intimidation can really help us overcome that very huge barrier. Because if there's a successful Crawford objection, in essence, that victim's testimony will not be allowed unless certain conditions are met. And one of them is that the defendant has forfeited their right to confrontation. And forfeiture by wrongdoing is based on the Sixth Amendment right that defendants have the right to confront their witnesses. It's not absolute. And where a defendant intimidates a witness or otherwise prevents them from participating in a case, then it can be established. And so the standard on forfeiture by wrongdoing is the preponderance of evidence. And this resource that's on your screen right now, as well as the resource prior to this, are two pieces that have really been developed and that go into depth how to really take situations where the perpetrator has intimidated the victim and to make sure that they do not go unaccountable because of it. And it's important to know that disabling a witness's car, convincing a witness to sign an affidavit, all of those things have been found to establish forfeiture by wrongdoing. And the last piece is the trial piece here, and a couple of things that we wanted to highlight in this piece. Again, the first is just the importance of selecting a jury and that is not going to hold myths and misperceptions, that's going to be open to the evidence, that's going to not have myths about human trafficking or domestic violence, and that's going to be able to listen to the evidence and to understand the different reasons why victims stay. And this goes through all portions of the trial. It is, it's important in terms of determining the opening and closing, your theme and your theory, and the impact on the victim. And so it's important to remember how you thread intimidation through all of this strategy. And we have some incredible resources online and articles that talk in more depth about how to do that, including a great monograph and some other articles, because I know we've sort of hit our time here, and so I just want to point out the key pieces. The last thing I wanted to talk about was our another forthcoming publication on benchmarks for progress. And this is a publication that should be out in a few weeks, which really helps communities assess opportunities for intimidation and to test whether or not they have closed those opportunities and whether or not they have really been able to if there are any gaps that they need to improve on. There are several principles that are included in this, and again, it's a much deeper, longer resource, but it's important because, again, we don't want to have to be dealing with these issues when they come up. We want to be able to create communities in which we can prevent these opportunities and make sure that we're prepared to respond to them when possible. And this is the Benchmarks for Progress, and it should be available in the next couple of weeks at the AEquitas resource. Charlie?
Thanks, Shannon. Thank you all so much for your attendance and participation today. You guys were really great at providing comments and feedback and asking questions, and I just encourage you guys to continue doing that. And you can reach out to Jen and Audrey. Their information is coming up here in just a second with any questions that you might have or any resources that you want to share or ask about. So as Jen mentioned, these resources are available at the link right here. We also have, sorry about that. Here's our library page, which includes monographs and additional publications that were referenced throughout the webinar. And just so you know, when you do exit iLink, it'll be sent to our website at equitasresource.org, where you can register for future webinars and training events and review additional information about Equitas. I'm also going to send you a link to a SurveyMonkey evaluation of this webinar, along with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and Jen and Audrey's bio. So please respond to that follow-up mail. If you're interested in continuing legal education credits, I do apologize for my quick speech and also that we ran over just a little bit on time. And do please remember that Equitas is a 24/7 technical assistance provider available to respond to questions, concerns, and training needs as they relate to prosecution and violence against women, and that Polaris project is also there to provide assistance with human trafficking cases, as well as their National Human Trafficking Resource Center and hotline number. So on behalf of Equitas, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody. And we'll stay on the line. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to answer that many questions throughout the webinar, but if you have some, you can feel free to chat those to me or email them, and we'll follow up with you guys. Thank you so much.